Well, hey everyone, this is Scott King and Kern Smith over at Zimperium, and thanks for joining us for app security and risk findings amongst mobile banking, payment, and crypto apps. So, Kern, how's it going up there in your part of the country?
Doing great, Scott. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Good, good. So, Kern and I are going to discuss some of the findings of about 1,000 different mobile apps, right? So these are mobile payment and banking apps. And specifically what we're going to do is we are going to point out all of the findings amongst the North America apps. So we did 1,000 globally, about 300 are in North America. And these are just some of the high level findings that we're going to run through today. We're going to talk about PII and looking at those over, query parameters, APIs. We're going to talk about obfuscation on how many apps do and do not actually obfuscate some of the code and assets. And then we're going to talk about some privacy permissions inside some of these apps where they may or may not need to be reading that part of your device, and fraud. So interesting, it pays to commit fraud over a mobile device. So this slide, what this is data from the RSA quarterly fraud report from earlier this year. And this is the average amount of fraudulent transactions in each one of these regions. So you can see Americas, UK, European Union, Australia, New Zealand. And then the report goes out to point out that mobile is actually a significantly higher number. So you can look, Kern, that, fraud on a mobile device is 2.5 times more profitable. Any idea why that may be?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always a combination of factors that go into it. But I mean, when you think about, just what is the device that folks use primarily, it's almost inevitably the mobile device, right? It's, attached to their hip, or, they're constantly looking at it continuously. So, and especially nowadays, the type of information that you access on a mobile device versus a traditional endpoint, there's really no difference between those types of information. And the maturity level of security solutions on your more traditional endpoints and assets that are accessed from there is going to be higher than mobile. I mean, mobile just hasn't been around nearly as long, and the type of visibility that organizations have into mobile assets is typically much less by a significant factor than any other traditional endpoint, be it a laptop or a web server, things of that nature. So you have this confluence of events that comes into the mobile assets, really the soft underbelly for malicious actors, and the numbers hold out. The return on investment is just significantly higher by a significant factor for mobile.
Yeah, a friend of mine in the space says that the ROI on, hacking mobile devices and mobile fraud is like 400, 500%. So if you're a enterprising cyber criminal, it pays to hack via mobile devices. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how they do that. The bank impersonation attacks are pretty popular. You may be familiar with these, where malware actually institutes an overlay image over the user's device. So when the user goes to log into, a credit card app or a mobile banking app, you're actually surrendering your username and password to the hacker. And then the malware also, Kern, it changes itself to the default SMS messenger, and it captures incoming two-factor codes, messages, things like that. It's pretty enterprising.
No, absolutely. And again, it goes to that kind of mobile-specific focus. Mobile devices are kind of the centerpiece of any type of zero trust authentication, or two-factor authentication. I mean, when you think about it, as an attacker, if I can obtain credentials of any sort, that's valuable to me, right? Because there's a high probability that they'll work, and especially as folks have started leveraging multi-factor authentication regardless of the asset. If you think about it, almost every single form of multi-factor resides on a mobile device in one way, shape, or form, be it an authentication app, be it SMS, be it email, or some other form. So if I'm a malicious actor and I'm trying to gain access to two items, I've got to target the mobile device. It just becomes inherent in that. And then the techniques that they're using are becoming ever, more and more sophisticated, either with variants of existing malware families and kind of the bifurcation of it, the Nubus, Cerberus, even the BlackRock malware, but also, kind of some of the polymorphic examples or items that are kind of using a Jekyll and Hyde technique to bypass any of the walled garden or app store scanning approaches. It's just becoming more and more common nowadays.
We actually posted a threat advisory on BlackRock on the blog yesterday. So it'll walk you through how it works and how to defend against it. But now we're moving on to obfuscation, Kern. So if you look left to right, basically what this is this is a separate study. There's 3,000 different Android mobile applications, mobile banking applications. And in each of the regions, what we're doing is we're plotting whether or not these apps use any type of obfuscation. So the light green is open source obfuscation. This just comes with Android Studio. The dark green at the bottom is a specialty security product like Zimperium provides. And this is whether or not you actually institute like a beefy enterprise obfuscation and shielding application. But Kern, the red means that you're not using anything. And these are finance apps. So this is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, it is particularly concerning, right? Because if you look at obfuscation, that's a great way of preventing attackers from mimicking the app, cloning the app, creating fraud with duplicate copies. But obviously, without it, they can now start kind of profiling the app to see what type of defense mechanisms, if there are any, that are embedded in there. And I would hazard a guess that the apps that don't have obfuscation, or maybe even are using open source, probably have very light, if any, capabilities around tampering, jailbreak detections, malware defense, things of that nature that are all kind of important when you talk about preventing financial fraud within these apps and all the other things that go into it. So it's not just obfuscation by itself, but I think it's indicative of the security maturity potentially within some of these applications. That's at least worth an investigation by the developers and the organizations that are responsible for these apps.
Yeah, definitely. And not obfuscating your app can lead to really, really bad results. There's a couple of examples here: the Tesco Bank example and the BitFi app that was hacked because the app itself just surrendered the keys, encryption keys, and it was easily hacked. Tesco Bank, though, Kern, what they did is the hackers actually used the mobile app to gain secrets to attack elsewhere. So a lot of people ask us about attacking via the mobile app, but maybe the app just gives away some secrets and then they don't need it anymore. They go attack, for a traditional method.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where you have to look at the entire life cycle of the application, from identifying what items may be within the application that attackers could leverage for further attacks. It could be hard-coded API tokens. It could be username, passwords, maybe unencrypted endpoints, things of that nature that you would want to address during the development cycle, and then have layered defenses on top of it with best practices around obfuscation, with anti-tampering capabilities, with active defense items. So really, when you look at it, it's not just, I think we're using obfuscation as an example, but it actually speaks to a larger problem or a larger issue when you look at the entire software development lifecycle of the application and identifying these specific risks, remediating them before the app goes live in a public sphere, and then having active capabilities both with kind of passive obfuscation and also active defense mechanisms. So when the app is live out in the wild, it's able to defend itself and you're able to gain telemetry around it.
Yeah, it's a good point. Obfuscation, eliminates or reduces some of the risks, but there's definitely other areas that you need to look at. So a little bit about the study. Again, if you want to take a look at this, we will send these out, and this is also available. You did get these slides ahead of time before today's webinar. And so if you do have a question while we go through some of the findings, we're not going to cover all the slides that you already received, but we will do some of the comparison slides. So if you have a question that you want to ask publicly or privately, you place it in the Q&A window in the Zoom console. privately, you can email us, and we'll get to your question as soon as we can. So, looking at the OWASP mobile top 10 results, from region to region, they were fairly consistent. These apps in North America actually did a little bit better
Yeah.
for the M8, for the code tampering on Android. They did a lot better than the other regions. But the M9, which is always the reverse engineering, those always have a high failure rate. Any comments on a couple of the of these statistics
Yeah.
for OWASP?
Yeah, I think it just kind of speaks to the maturity model, the security maturity model around mobile assets and kind of the evolution that's taking place, right? Typically, what we see is that most organizations, the business is driving, pushing out a mobile asset, because there's a business function that needs to be met, and then security becomes an overlay on top of that, right? Some aspects are more mature than others, right, in those areas. But I think what you're seeing is the business is driving capabilities and feature sets, and security is, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but it's a trailing leg of that development cycle. So and again, you get into that entire SDLC of items, really, where we see advantages coming to play from a return on investment perspective for our customer bases, just the entire platform approach and identifying those vulnerability and weaknesses early on the dev cycle or in the life cycle of the application, and doing iterative analysis, because as we see new versions may introduce new vulnerabilities and new capabilities, things of that nature. So being able to have some sort of automated way of staying on top of that becomes critical.
Yeah, the new versions are interesting because you'll look at and be familiar with the code that your team is putting in, but you may have some legacy code that you don't really understand what's going on, and maybe some technical debt in there. So if you're not, continuously looking at all the risks in the app, then you may be, you may be having more risk than you know about, right? So you need to take a look at.
Totally.
So in the study, what we've done is we've downloaded all these public apps, either from the iOS, the Apple App Store and Google Play, and we've plotted each one of the apps in terms of a relative score. On the left and the lower left, these apps need significant improvement over their peers. In the upper right-hand corner, these are basically the apps that are doing a better job. So you can kind of look at this scatter chart, and we'll have one for Android a little bit later. But each one of the findings contribute to the placement on this chart. We're going to go and talk a little bit about some of the critical security findings that would shove you to the left, right? So this would would indicate that you need to improve some of the security inside your app. So Kern, here we talk about username and passwords exposed in URLs, remote SQL injections, swizzling and jailbroken method detected. Anything that pops out here in terms of how the North America apps may compare to the other regions?
Yeah, I think what you see is, probably the maturity model within North America is probably a little bit more mature overall when you look at, the rest of other regions. It could be a variety of reasons, right? If you look at kind of the history of when, iOS was adopted in the Americas versus other, regions, that may have something to do with it. But I think what you're seeing is probably over time more of a consolidation of items. But even in there, I think, you look at security risk, it is striking with the username and passwords being exposed. I mean, that's just kind of step one from any reverse engineer to see if anything like that is exposed in traffic in transit or even within the app itself, and then going from there. So, while, like I said, the North American market may be slightly more mature on the margins, it's not that much of a market difference between other areas of the world, to be honest.
And then some of the other, these are privacy or data leakage findings. I always look at a couple of different ones, especially we're talking about the username and password and the URLs. So now we have query parameters containing, some type of identifiable information in a mobile device that could mean different things. In California, your location is private
Hmm.
information, and the audio functions, right? So can record audio. You really need to make sure that if you are recording audio, you're actually storing that pretty securely. So anything that sticks out here, Kern?
Well, I think overall what we're seeing as a trend in that organizations, privacy and data leakage is becoming more and more of a regulatory requirement, especially around the California Privacy Shield laws. New York is working on some things, and obviously GDPR, if you do any type of business in EMEA, is paramount. But I think beyond the regulatory items, if you look at things that have been in the news recently, there is a very big business aspect to this stuff. I don't think anybody necessarily wants to be on the front page of a news article saying that, hey, their mobile app is doing X, Y, Z, and having things potentially being misconstrued or things of that nature. So being able to understand, all right, what is the data or the capabilities that a mobile app is accessing, and basically being able to make a business judgment is the juice worth the squeeze. Is the functionality that's being enabled by that really justified, especially as we're seeing in the different operating system versions, both Android and iOS. They're becoming more and more explicit with users around what permissions or what capabilities apps have access to. So I think that's going to be a very critical item for organizations just from a business and user trust perspective to have a really good handle and really good justification around what is it accessing and how is it handling the data that it is accessing and maintaining.
Interesting is the juice worth the squeeze. I'm trying to figure out how hard I'm gonna have to squeeze my device to make it juice come out. So I'm still wrapped on that. Sorry. Uh, so this is Android scatter plot. So if you notice the distribution on this chart is quite different.
Yeah.
They're, from a security risk, most of the dots are on the left. From a privacy risk, most of the dots are up on the top. Very
Mm-hmm.
different than iOS. So that, it makes you wonder, about the reputation of Android. It kind of gets a bad rap because it's easier to get malware on an Android device. But from a privacy perspective, like these apps look a little bit better than the iOS apps.
Yeah, and it could be due to a lot of different factors and whatnot. I mean, when you look at the distribution of iOS versus Android, globally versus within the U.S., I think iOS probably skews a little bit more versus the global trends in the U.S. than it does globally. So I think you may get into some conversations around areas of emphasis and the customer base that organizations are serving and the type of emphasis that they put onto those platforms specifically. But I think again it comes back down to these. We've seen it, and we've seen it time and time again. These numbers can change at the drop of a hat, right? So what we're really looking at is a bit of a snapshot in time, but what we've seen over time is kind of an evolution where the gap between Android and iOS somewhat shrinks a little bit, or they become somewhat similar. And then as the new operating systems release new capabilities, maybe there's kind of shifts in those items because there are different capabilities that you can do on iOS versus Android. But the concerns still remain the same. What are the vulnerabilities that are specific to the platform or specific to third-party SDKs that are ingested? We're seeing that more and more, especially as functionality looks to be enabled. And then just common best practices around security, around encryption, around how you're handling data, and how you are handling or maybe not handling, client secrets, API tokens, user credentials, things of that nature. It all kind of goes into it regardless of platform.
Yeah, exactly. So, so some of the critical security findings for these Android mobile banking apps, North America kind of stands out using the WebKit to download files.
Mm-hmm.
Blindly loading jar files is pretty high. And interesting, a lot of the apps, about, let's see, I'm looking at the chart, 13-14% on average still use a vulnerable Facebook SDK.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. And then the security certificates. Like I just wouldn't want that finding on any of these apps. But if you accept all security certificates, you may need some improvement.
No, absolutely. And I think part of it speaks to maybe when a point of emphasis was put on to developing the Android platform versus iOS and, continual code maintenance as well, right? If you look at something like the vulnerable Facebook SDK version, what that speaks out to me is, maybe that's not an area of emphasis for the developers, right? Or maybe security teams weren't necessarily aware of that vulnerability. And if the code's working, why change it, right? You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of thing. So, I think you're looking at a after effect of, all right, what's the OS distribution within the various markets and the points of emphasis and not necessarily skill sets, but just, um, priorities, if you will, within the business on, what do they need to look at? What are they maintaining? And that goes into, okay, do you necessarily need to have an expert in a specific platform considering the rapid evolutions taking place? Or do you want to leverage more automation so that your experts can be freed up for more business-centric activities?
Yeah, and then on this one, Kern, what sticks out to me, because we've already talked about the PII
Yeah,
in the query parameters. I'll get that out. And then storing inline API keys and values. So North America is way more than the rest of the regions. So should
yeah,
we be concerned there?
I would absolutely. I mean, this is not an inconsequential difference. You're looking at kind of a difference in an average of 25% to close to 40%. So we're not really talking about the margins here, right? This is a pretty staggering number when you think about it. And again, I think it speaks back to um, OS distribution, priorities of development for different platforms and whatnot, and just knowledge transfer as the platforms evolve. What this kind of indicates to me is maybe a not a lagging, but just an area of catch up that the North American market needs to do relative to the rest of the global market. What I'd be very interested in seeing is maybe what these findings looked like maybe a year, 2, 3 years ago, if you will, when probably a lot of effort was put into developing some of these applications, and then kind of seeing how these maybe grew or contracted over time. Because I think again, it's just a point of emphasis, especially as a lot of organizations are resource constrained from just a technical talent perspective. How do we free up the technical talent to focus on those business critical activities while having automated systems in place to kind of make sure that standards are being kept through no fault of anyone.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that. I've actually plotted some of these apps over time. So I'll take a single app, and you'd think it'd be pretty consistent for security and for privacy. But sometimes, there's this huge sawtooth chart of how
Yeah.
the ranking goes up and down based on what features they put into the apps. And sometimes they just really don't understand the unintended consequences of a new piece of code,
Well,
a new SDK. You really have to look at this all the time to make sure that you're not exposing, any secrets.
yeah, well, and to be completely fair, I have a lot of sympathy for the teams that are putting these apps together, and the security teams that have to review this stuff. This area is evolving, daily, right? New vulnerabilities, new issues, things of that nature are being discovered, and especially when you look at the climate, most of the teams are being asked to maintain, a huge amount of code, or have a lot of different job responsibilities where they're not focused on one platform, much less one, app. They've got to cover a broad, swath of areas. So they're being asked to be both experts and generalists at the same time. And that's a difficult job, if not impossible, for anyone to do, right? I don't care what your what your skill set is. It's hard to keep up. It's not really a question of keeping up. It's just there's a lot of stuff going on. So how can you leverage kind of that collective knowledge to smooth out those sawtooths, right? So the sawtooths really happen during the dev cycle, and the standards being kept throughout releases, so your risk is minimized once the app goes live and all of your risk is identified early on in that development cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Well, here is, I believe, our last data slide. What sticks out here is the accessing the phone call log. Like North
Hmm.
America is just not even on that chart.
Yeah.
And then the beacons, right? So
Mm.
the beacon at the bottom for North America is quite high.
Yeah.
You know, South America and North America are the highest. The beacon functionality, you know, is interesting because if you have access to the microphone and you can record audio, and you're using the subsonic beacons, that you could leak data, you know, if you're not doing it correctly.
It's definitely a potential, and it's concerning. I think again, it goes back to what I would be very interested in, talking with, some of the teams that own these different apps is, okay, how are you using the beacon, or are you actively using it right now? Right? Because we've seen it time and time again, functionality may get introduced during a dev cycle or a QA cycle or an experimental cycle, that just kind of gets left in there even after the business use case has depreciated, if you will, or has gone away, but the legacy code is still in there. So using beacons as an example, is it really in use? And if so, how is it in use? Right? Because I think what you're going to see is a trend in the marketplace, especially driven by the users and some of the more explicit visibility being given into capabilities of the app, is they're going to start questioning, hey, why do you need this? Why do you need access to this? How are you using this? What is the implication around there, especially as the North American market becomes more and more mature around data privacy from a consumer perspective?
Yeah. Yeah. I've taken a look at all these charts, and, you know, if you broad brush it, you know, North America is more mature in terms of the security and the privacy, but still there are, you know, there are certain apps that are just leaving gaping holes uh, for, for leakage, for security concerns. Um, you know, one of the more popular ones that I like is the clipboard, right? I hate
Mm-hmm.
the clipboard access. You know, for iOS, it's disappearing, right? Or at least it'll warn you for the next
Right.
version that's coming out. But, you
Right.
know, because you can capture passwords, if I have a password manager and I copy paste into two different apps, then, you know, one app has access to that. That's pretty scary. And then SMS messages, right? So these are two-factor codes, but, you know, I'm authenticating on the same device.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it just goes, it's that difference between, accessing look, there are legitimate reasons why, just use your pasteboard example. There's legitimate reasons why apps would access the pasteboard. A lot of it's driven around, uh, relatively benign features. There's nothing malicious around it. It's, hey, how do I help the user and make the app, function better, maybe for accessibility services, things of that nature. But again, it goes back to, is the juice worth the squeeze? Or if you're asking for that, you know, how do you grab user trust or validate user trust so they don't think that you're doing anything nefarious for that? So again, it's being able to understand what the deliberate intent was by accessing or leveraging this feature, and basically justifying the business use case, with the technical aspects that you need to enable to drive the business use case, or the business feature functionality that you're trying to enable, right? Typically, there's nothing really malicious around it. It's more about, look, is it worth it to do this, or do we need to be more explicit with the user community around why we're doing this?
Yeah, we were talking about the beacon earlier, and if you look here, this device has access to the device microphone. North America is not on the chart, which would lead me to believe that your example of leaving the code in there and not using it, it may
Hmm.
be, it may apply in this case.
Absolutely.
All right, so what do we, you know, what do we recommend? What should you do about this? So we talked a lot about, you know, continuously testing, making sure that you understand what is in your application that may be exposing secrets. Maybe there's some code in there that you're just not using anymore. Take it out if you're not using it. Shield and harden your app to, you know, make reverse engineering. Just make that really, really difficult. You know, if someone's looking at your app looking for secrets, just make them move on. Don't be a target. And then defend from fraud. So you can actually look at the health of your user's mobile device and make determinations on whether or not you allow her to have a certain function. maybe if they have malware on the device, you don't want them adding new payees or something like that. Any examples that that you walk through in the field here, Kern, on based on what customers ask you about their mobile banking apps? What do you recommend them to do?
Well, I think the real goal is how do they implement this type of security and review process into the life cycle of the app, where you're not creating arbitrary gates or delays for a go-to-market. And I mean, that's kind of the real thing, is that a lot of folks that I talk to, they're going, hey, look, it's great that we abide by best practices, but I can't impact the business, right? I can't all of a sudden put a 2-week delay into releasing a new version. And that's where you get into, okay, well, let's talk about an overall holistic view and an overall platform approach, so that each of those 3 items just becomes a natural part of the life cycle and development and deployment and maintenance of the application, so that you don't create unnatural barriers to deploy, to release, to the entire SDLC. And the ultimate idea is to shift left in the entire life cycle. And I think that's where a lot of the folks that we engage with, it really resonates with them, versus having disparate tools that kind of create those arbitrary blockers or gates throughout those 3 different components.
Yeah, definitely. Doing it earlier in the life cycle costs less. Fixing an error, from production costs a lot more. And the development teams, the QA teams, they understand that, right? So they know. But making the case for testing earlier is it's a business decision as well, because those systems they require investments. So if you have any other questions about the data in the report, we'll take questions now. If you would like a risk assessment for your app, we'll actually tell you which dot you are in the report. And if you're not in there, we'll scan your app and kind of walk you through one of the assessments. And then if you'd like any custom data, if you want to look at some of our threat data, obviously we can provide you another session just for your team. So, Kern, I will ask a question that was asked yesterday.
Okay.
And so not today, but somebody asked yesterday about the BankBot or BlackRock malware. Could a user tell the difference between the real overlay, a fake overlay? Can the user tell the difference when that's going on?
The short answer is, a normal user, no. Typically, they would have no clue, honestly. And I wouldn't say it's an unequivocal no. There's always that exception to it. But I mean, that's the power of these types of attacks, is that they're not going for 100% success rate. They're going for, look, if I can get above average or a reasonable return on investment, I'm good. It's not like they worry about one person catching them and the jigs up, so to speak. It's about rates of success, et cetera. And a normal user, and that's what makes these type of attacks so effective, they wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah. We did have a question about the presentation. If we actually did send the presentation out ahead of time, but if you want to grab this specific version of the presentation, you check my Twitter. I'll post it right after this session. Or you can go to zimperium.com and hit the contact us button and just ask the direct question there, and then we'll get to you. But thanks everyone for joining. Kern, thanks for investing your time and talking to our North American audience about mobile security. Any closing thoughts?
No, just really great having this conversation, Scott. And hopefully folks found it informative and helpful.
All right. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions, please contact us. We'd be happy to help.